Today at the bodega, I'm going to be using this plastic egg that I got at Dollar Tree to make Final Fantasy VII's own Russian nesting doll enemy, known as Grangalan?
You say your name right now.
I'm going to be making 3 Grangalans, and being that the process of making them is the same, I'll focus the video on this size. First, I'm going to have to sand the whole thing, which means these eyes gotta go. I use a high grit sandpaper in order to give the smooth finish a more porous surface without leaving any deep scratches behind. It's a tedious process, but one that helps the clay apply without any issues. That's looking pretty good. After I'm done sanding, it's time to plot out where this thing's face is gonna be. I start by giving it a crispy Steve Harvey drawn in fake hairline.
You have some explaining to do.
Listen, I looked up to Steve Harvey's hairline. Growing up, I wanted mine to be that sharp, so when I found out it was fake, it was like seeing a hero fall. Once I have a sense of where the hairline is, I can move on to drawing the eyes, which is what this step is all about. All these other lines are just my way of having a mental image of where they'll be placed after I start setting the clay on top of the egg. It may seem a little useless since it'll eventually be covered, but something about marking them out first makes the second go around much simpler. With the lines done, it's time to work on that face. I designed and 3D printed these to act as the metal casing around the eyes. A little bit of blue putty to keep the casings on the face, and now I have a stencil I can use to cut out the eyes. Having learned valuable lessons about cutting from my last project, I make it a point to cut these out with as little injury as possible. A few more stabs and there, this eye is ready to pop out. I do my best to get rid of any loose shards of plastic remaining. Before I glue on the eye casings, I want to make sure to cover everything in clay. It's best to separate them, and by the looks of it, I think I'll start with the bottom first. No Sculpey this time, it's air dry clay all the way. I pull out what I think I'll need and get to rolling. Once it's nice and flat, I take a piece off and cover the bottom. A little smoothing with the thumbs and I'm ready to tackle the top piece. For the head, I end up wetting my fingers in order to make the process easier. Montmartre clay lays down smoother wet than it does dry. If you ever have a hard time getting it to stick or just trying to add a new piece of clay on top, a little water works wonders. Using a plastic palette knife, I slowly press its hairline back into place. Any slip-ups along the way can be reversed by simply smoothing the clay with a wet Q-tip. It's like having an eraser to hide all the mistakes. I continue adding lines to this eggy foe's face, being sure to refer back to my reference photos throughout the process. Line after line, and this enemy is starting to come to life. For the bottom, I do the same, being sure to take into consideration the lines that I had originally drawn in pen. A bit more smoothing with the Q-tip and Humpty Dumpty is ready to be put back together again. I try my best to smooth out more of the surface, and after about half an hour, this deviled egg is dry. Using the palette knife again, I get into the cracks where the clay has become a bit pebbly. After breaking dumps into 2 again, I give it a once over before I move on to the next step, gluing the eye casings into the holes. This requires a surgeon's hand, which, there's something you should know about me.
My hand does not shake, ever. Ever.
With the trembling out of the way, I can add baking soda around the edges of the eyes to create a super bond with the glue that will make these eyes permanently affixed. Using a medical cotton swab and a bit of Bondo glazing putty, I seal up the gaps around the eyes and cover any remaining cracks. After that, I give it a good sanding to smooth it out as best possible. With everything sanded, it's prime time. Using a recipe of 2 parts Mod Podge to 1 part paint, I coat Eggsy in a generous helping of primer sludge. Once this egg is completely covered and dried, it's time to bust out the airbrush gun for some painting. I start by giving the top of its head a healthy coat of brown paint. The bottom gets the same treatment as well as the stripes that go around its lower half. After it's dried, I scramble up some yellow paint and start giving Grangalan his trademark yellow coat. I fashion him a little shower cap to keep the yellow from getting on the previously painted areas. I use the same piece of silly putty to protect the stripes on its bottom. With that done, it's time to move on to the eyes. These casings are silver, so I'll be using a bit of metallic paint to make them stand out. Using my pinky to balance on its head, I gently apply the paint, being careful not to get it on the yellow. The eyes are done, but the problem now is that they're hollow. I need to make sure they have a backing to them so they're not see-through. For that, I'll take a piece of crafting foam and trace out the width of the eyes. This way I can make a strip that I can then glue to the inside of the head. Here's where years of training under the tutelage of Mark Kistler come in handy. Art attack time.
Art attack! Hi! Draw.
I learned a lot about drawing from that man. Maybe one day I'll go through my old sketchbooks and make a video on it. For now, this eye shield needs a few more cuts to be completed. I glue the foam securely in place, and now it's time to bedazzle the front of Grangy's forehead. I'll be using these studs as rivets to replicate the cross design emblazoned on the front of its head. Setting out a sheet of parchment paper, I begin to lay out the diamond studs. I poured a little bit of CA glue on the parchment paper and begin the dip and press method. Grangalan just went from dull to dazzling.
Don't be dull, be dazzling.
Now there's the part where I completely forgot that Grangorgan's mouth opens with the top part vertically ascending rather than opening like a hinge. The plan is to have a succession of granados being spit up by its predecessor. I take some more CA glue and attach the granola's top to its bottom, sprinkling baking soda to create a stronger bond. With all the gaganas finished and ready to replicate, it's time to build a base for them to do battle on. For that, I'll be using some XPS foam in this torch. I've watched Boylai Hobbytime use this technique and have always wanted to try it out. Be sure to be in a well-ventilated area and wearing a respirator because these fumes will kill the lungs. I move on to cutting acrylic dowels to the correct height for each Gregorio and superglue them onto these giant bumblebee butts.
No me gusta.
Again, the cotton swab comes in handy for smearing the glue around the dowel. I press Grangula down into a pre-cut hole as I measure and eventually fix Grangula Jr. in front of its pappy. Granny the Third rounds out this trio, completing the hat trick. I decided to scrap the burnt floor and instead carved more of it out. The new plan is to make a muddy center with light desert and grass around the sides. For those interested in my carving technique, I just took an X-Acto and scored the area I wanted to be muddied. Then using the side of my blade, I shaved off piece after piece of foam. It's like slicing off thin pieces of deli meats. That's all there is to it. For the mud, I'll be using this plaster that's like 6 years old. Some white acrylic caulk that's fresh from 2017, Mod Podge even though it should be Elmer's glue, and some brown paint. This recipe I learned from Bob the Odd. He used it for lava and I applied it to mud. 2 pulls of caulk mixed with a generous helping of glue and finally some paint for a little bit of pigment. During the mixing stage, you'll want to add a bit of water until you get a sort of milky consistency. I forgot that step. After the mixture is a little milky, I start adding the plaster. I'm looking to get a pancake batter consistency. Again, my materials are pretty old, so I'm not sure if that's adding to the graininess of the mix. Goopy. When it's all been properly mixed, I take my plastic spoon and gently start laying the mud throughout the trench. I have to get it into all the nooks and crannies. After the plaster dried, it began to bubble and crack severely, perhaps because of the age of my materials, so I had to go over everything with plaster alone. That's why the color changed. To get it back to Browntown, I laid down paint that's reminiscent of the plastas I had to dodge as a kid growing up in the Bronx. Sometimes you didn't know if them piles came from dogs or men. With all that finished, it's time to sandy up the sides. Using a mixture of khaki and brown paint, I begin laying layer after layer down, leaving time to dry in between. Once the large portions are nice and covered, I begin touching up all the minor spots. I use the airbrush to add different layers to the mud as well as the sand. Being that you fight Grangrans near Corel, I wanted the ground to reflect the red sands you find surrounding the vast Corel Desert. It's looking pretty good, but now I want to add a bit of greenery to the sides. I used some tacky glue and spread it out pretty evenly before sprinkling on a heavy seasoning of green turf. With one side done, it's time for the other, and before you know it, I was about to make a mess of things. So here we have the behind the scenes. The glue spilled, the light stopped working, everything is proper bungled, and I'm the cause. As I get everything cleaned, enjoy this brief montage. If my memory serves right, Grangulians would spit gears at you when not vomiting clones. I take the acrylic rod that'll support the gear and use it to mark where I want my hole to be. After drilling it, I put the rod in its place. Once I level the gear with Granguji's mouth, I score the rod and then cut it to size. It turns out to be a perfect fit. I fix it into place and this Grangalan is ready to multiply. Thank you everyone for joining me. If this is your first time, consider checking out my playlist, and if you like what you see, feel free to subscribe and join this little crafting community. If you have any Final Fantasy VII enemies you'd like to see me tackle in the future, leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your suggestions. Always remember, any day is a good day to start crafting. Until next time, my friends, God bless.